Thank you all very much for being here for our last and final panel. I think it's been an amazing conference, don't you? Just wonderful speakers, wonderful insights and discussion and so on. And what I'd like to do is for everyone to have a special thanks to the founders of the feast, as it were, to Jim Byron, to Chris Nordyke, and to Jameson Feltz for their hard work in helping to bring all this together. Our topic is AI and energy as grand strategy. Now, those are usually categories that I think most of us think about in separate compartments. AI, isn't that all about ChatGPT and about the rise of the machines and the Arnold Schwarzenegger type of takeover that generative AI is going to bring? That's sort of where the public debate on AI has centered. And in energy, we get the discussion and two very different plans with regard to energy strategy from our two presidential candidates right now. But a discussion that tends to focus on supplies of fossil fuels or liquid natural gas, or about clean renewables and wind and solar and nuclear. But what you're going to find out this the next hour is that these two separate technological issues and economic issues are very much intertwined, and that to develop a grand strategy with regard to one while ignoring a grand strategy and a grand strategic approach to the other is probably misguided, and in fact one could argue even dangerous, both from an economic but also from a national security standpoint. And the two panelists that we've got and have brought together here for our panel are expert on both of these points of intersection. And what we're going to see, I think, is a discussion about how artificial intelligence and machine learning and the nation's energy resources and energy capacity, how those two are going to have enormous impact on each other, and why they must be thought about as together, as opposed to keeping them separate in a way. About our panelists, Mark Mills is Executive Director of the National Center for Energy Analytics and is a contributing editor at the City Journal, a faculty fellow at Northwestern University School of Engineering, and co-founding partner of Montrose Lane. He's the author of several books. The one that I think is the most interesting for purposes of our discussion is The Cloud Revolution, how the convergence of new technologies will unleash the next economic boom in a roaring 2020s. But also, I can recommend Digital Cathedrals, published in 2020, Work in the Age of Robots, and The Bottomless Well, which is a fascinating and insightful discussion about the issue of energy and sources of energy and what takes place in that realm and where it's going in the future. Mark served as chairman and CTO of ICX Technologies and helped to bring that company public in 2007. If that's not enough of accomplishments, Mark earlier served in the Reagan White House Science Office, and prior to that was an experimental physicist and a development engineer in work on microprocessors and also in missile guidance. Brian Cavanaugh, our other panelist, who's sitting next to me, is the Senior Vice President of American Global Strategies, which is an international strategic advisory firm, co-founded by our distinguished speaker this morning, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Mr. Cavanaugh focuses on critical infrastructure and security and resilience, crisis management planning, continuity of operations, and disaster response and recovery operations. in all of those areas. He has considerable experience in talking about and understanding and implementing plans with all of those. Mr. Cavanaugh brings to our discussion today extensive experience from serving in the White House as the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Resilience Policy at the National Security Council. While at the NSC, Brian led efforts to secure critical infrastructure and manage federal responses to domestic incidents, including infrastructure relating to energy. Now, before I got into the policy analyst business, I was an historian, still am, I think. I've published 10 books on European and American history, one of which was a finalist for Pulitzer Prize, another was a New York Times bestseller. I think I qualify as an historian and carry those credentials with me. And one of the things that I think we can say is that when you look back in the course of history, that what it is that makes great powers, what it is that makes great nations, is a combination of three factors. The first is a free flow of information. The second is a free flow of innovation, which is why open societies tend to do so much better and last longer and have more resilience than closed societies. The third characteristic is a free flow of energy. Energy both in a material sense, but also, I would argue, in a spiritual sense. And it is the confluence of energy, of information and innovation that really is the philosophical foundations for what we're going to talk about today. Now, as it happens, President Richard Nixon was someone who had really far-sighted views about this aspect of where American society was going and where American future lay. And in the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo in 1973, it was President Nixon who launched Project Energy Independence with a long-term goal, which today I think still resonates with where America's energy policy needs to go and what technologies we both support of it. And we happen to have, to start our panel discussion, a video clip of President Nixon talking about and announcing the launching of Project Independence.
It can be summed up in one word that best characterizes this nation and its essential nature. That word is independence. From its beginning 200 years ago, throughout its history, America has made great sacrifices of blood and also of treasure to achieve and maintain its independence. In the last third of this century, our independence will depend on maintaining and achieving self-sufficiency in energy. What I have called Project Independence 1980 is a series of plans and goals set to ensure that by the end of this decade, Americans will not have to rely on any source of energy beyond our own. As far as energy is concerned, this means we will hold our fate and our future in our hands alone.
Mark, I'm going to start our discussion with you. You have, in fact, today just come from keynoting a conference at the American Petroleum Institute, which is one of the major pillars of talking about energy policy. And I'm hoping that you can give us some idea about what the mood is like there pre-election at API and with the discussions taking place there. But I'd also like you to talk about the testimony that you recently gave to a congressional committee on the relationship between AI and America's energy policy. So do you want to get us started by talking about those two things?
Well, sure, Arthur. I do want to say first that for those who are not appropriate fans of your books, that your most recent book about the heart of a Viking is a must-read. It's not just the history of Vikings in Norway, and of course you're a Viking, but just want to make sure we get that out there. Promote your book. My book is much drier. It's The Cloud. So the feelings, the mood at American Petroleum Institute, well, I would say they're worried.
Yeah.
That would be the right word to use. Trade associations have to thread the needle because they deal with not only diverse members who have different opinions, but also they deal with the fact that they have to attempt to be bipartisan in forging policy or opposing policy. But they're clearly worried that the current administration's policies and plans are foundationally and deliberately, and not secretly, antithetical to expanding domestic oil and gas production, even though in the political season we're in, the rhetoric seems slightly different. The actual execution of policies or the attempt to execute policies have been counterfactual to the claim that, there's support for the future of American oil and gas production. So I think they're worried. They're worried for good reason. I mean, the way you impede an industry in the United States, rather than just by diktat, is by creating friction, by how you slow walk permits, and in addition to, the administrative state is very powerful. An example that I have used that's illustrative is if you note that the time it takes to get a permit to drill in Bureau of Land Management controlled lands for oil, in this case would be for hydraulic fracturing and shale, under the Obama administration averaged somewhere in the 300 to 800 days. And then the time, no change in law occurred between that and then the Trump administration, and the permitting times were, a zero was taken off, typically 30 to 40 days. Same laws, adhering to the same rules, a different just behavior.
Faster.
Yeah. So those things matter, because if your capital's at risk and you face 1 to 2 years delay in getting a permit, never mind building, you'll steer away from those domains. Anyway, I think the fact I would throw out is that what was interesting about President Nixon's observation and call for project energy independence was driven, of course, by oil and oil markets. The fact is that since he said that, the consumption and production of oil globally has increased, in fact, dramatically. So the world doesn't use less oil now than it did then. It uses far more oil. And that's been true every year except for grotesque recessions and great lockdowns, which are temporary. And the only change that's significant in that time period is that we have essentially achieved his goal of independence because of the, quote, shale revolution, which also reset the price of oil, it changed the geopolitics of oil. But what's interesting to me, and is an amateur historian, is that while the president laid out a goal for independence as a Republican, what the Congress, in fact, did to execute the goal of independence, and he was talking about oil and gas because that's what the embargo was about, was oil. What the Energy Policy and Conservation Act that was enacted by Congress did was almost entirely focused on not increasing oil production, not finding new oil, not providing technology and incentives for oil, but to avoid using oil, to conserve oil, to find alternatives to oil. So if we had, since he was president, roughly a half century of attempt to replace oil, that's essentially what DOE has been doing. And that was, of course, created later by a subsequent president, as you know, the Department of Energy. So it was again, I will say it was a misguided execution of a goal. I would only add one other thing to President Nixon's objective, which was to be independent. 12 or 14 years ago, before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I proposed that independence was a bad idea, with all due respect to President Nixon, that I wasn't a believer in independence because isolation in the world doesn't work well, and it's what independence implies. I think what he meant, if I had been around to ask him at the time, was that we wanted to be in a position of strength. And so I maybe unfortunately created the idea and the testimony of energy dominance, that if you're in a geopolitical negotiation, implicit or explicit, you really have one of two postures, one of subservience or dominance when you go into the negotiation. I prefer the latter. And so what the United States has now done is achieved a position of dominance by being the largest producer of oil and gas on the planet, an increase in production greater than any time in human history. And that didn't come about because of his wise view that we needed to do something like that, but it took a lot longer than he hoped it by about 30 years. That's a detail, right? But we got there because of what you described, which was free innovation, capacity to pursue the innovation of hydraulic fracturing, the capacity to have free capital markets, so the ideas and the markets flowed, and the country was able to do something that was really quite remarkable. Finally, as it relates to AI, one could say a lot about the energy use of AI. For those who follow the news at all, you saw the headlines last week that Microsoft announced the power purchase agreement, which is a way to fund the refurbishment of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant to bring it online. It's a city-scale power plant, 800 megawatts, and they're bringing it back online so they can purchase all of the city-scale worth of electricity for one data center that will be primarily AI-infused data center. The number of data centers like that are currently planned are numbered in the hundreds. The number of nuclear power plants available for refurbishing, you can count on one hand in the United States. The time it takes to build a new nuclear power plant, you need 2 hands, maybe 3, to count the years, not months, to get there. So this has been blamed on AI, but in a technical fact, all of the surprise, which was the proximate reason for the Senate hearing in May, on the surprise of the massive increase in electric demand being reported around the country, is on data centers, and the attachment to that as being AI is interesting, but technically not correct. Only about 10%, maybe in some regions 20% of the surprising increase in electric demand is coming from AI itself. It's actually coming from a massive expansion in the physical infrastructure of the cloud, which is what my book's about. So the trillions of dollars that private markets have devoted annually to building out cloud infrastructure surprised everybody, since it all has to be plugged in, to suddenly require more electricity than the markets have planned to supply, because the supply side has now been constrained by regulators, politicians, and planners. The demand side, using electricity to do something creative, which is not deep fakes to embarrass political candidates. That's not the primary use of AI. It's the most fun use of AI, frankly. I mean, some of the latest ones going around that Elon Musk has retweeted have been kind of fun. But the primary use of AI in markets is because of its profound efficacy in improving conventional compute. That's essentially. So both are expanding. And the AI is an accelerant expanding conventional compute and consuming its own energy at the same time. So they're intimately linked. Since if we don't produce the power, you won't build the data centers here. China will produce the power because they're building coal plants at a furious pace, and they will build the data centers there.
What's China doing with regard to nuclear power? Because, of course, that becomes also I won't say fast track, but certainly a key way in which you can increase energy outputs exponentially in ways that make even fossil fuel plants seem rather sort of slow and ineffectual.
Well, China, we gifted China essentially no net price the Westinghouse designs for nuclear power plants, which was a political move a few years ago, almost 2 decades ago now. So the Chinese have been furiously building and improving on conventional reactors that we invented, we built. They're the largest builders of new nuclear power plants in the world at the moment. Number 2 is Russia, selling conventional light water reactors to other countries. And France, of course, has announced, and I think they'll stick with their pledge, to double their nuclear fleet. So they have a very significant capacity. But China is at the moment leading in the actual deployment of both current generation of reactors, which are the large reactors like 3 Mile Island, next generation reactors, so-called molten salt, and different types of breeding reactors, as well as space reactors. If we want to talk about geopolitics, you don't do interesting things in space without nuclear power. Solar power doesn't get you what you need, whether it's for weapon systems or putting things in orbit. To go to Mars, we're going to need nukes. And at the moment, we led the nuclear space propulsion development for years. and that went into the back burner. There's still things going on, but I would say China is leading there. And for a space station of consequence to do meaningful things, solar arrays don't provide enough power. So space-class nuclear reactors, leadership's in China. I would suspect some leadership is in Russia there, but I think it's probably classified.
Yeah. Brian, we've got three concepts now that we've come into play. One introduced by President Nixon, which is the idea of energy independence, which was a long-time goal, especially after the Arab oil embargo, when the U.S. realized that having once been a leader in energy output and production, it had now fallen way behind what it was that the most volatile region in the world, the Middle East, had now taken the lead in the 1970s. We've got energy dominance, as Mark has been talking about, in a discussion about how you can use America's energy output as leverage in a geopolitical competition, not just with China, but also in terms of supporting our allies and helping to build a worldwide energy network that can support growth and sustain it over time. But there's a third aspect I want you to talk about specifically, and that's energy security, and the way in which a lot of the work that you've done with regard to infrastructure and protecting critical infrastructure will have a huge impact on how we think about where America's energy dominance can go and where it's headed, but also about how AI dominance is also going to require a lot of attention to how we protect those energy resources that can sustain that growth.
Absolutely, and thank you, Arthur. And I've read several books, very colorful, always entertaining. Thank you. And one thing about consistency, here it is 45, 50 years later, and the Middle East is still volatile. So we've got some consistency in the world of inconsistencies. Yes. I think, to step back and look at energy security through a grand strategy, and I think that's what we're all here today to discuss, this grand strategy from various perspectives. When you look at energy security over time, it's been a challenge that it predates President Nixon, but really it's hyper-escalated in this digital era with cyber. So I could sit here and bore you all with how vulnerable we are due to cyber, and we can talk about how shiny objects such as AI can be used as tools to secure infrastructure, but at the same time, you have to understand our adversaries are also going to be using AI as a mechanism to defeat those measures to mitigate. So one of the things we looked at when I was at the National Security Council was we do a subpar job of prioritizing funding towards critical infrastructure security and resilience. And I think just to hit pause on that right there, on where the NSC was at, and I'll talk to you about where we are today, and then we'll go back to that conversation. Where are we today on energy security resilience? We have a vision that lacks a long-term view. The current administration has taken this approach that we're going to mandate a lot of uses against our energy production. So you've mandated the purchase and use of EVs. You've mandated the elimination of certain appliances. All of this is putting a strain on the energy grid. Simultaneously, we've also mandated a move, in my opinion, an irresponsible move, away from current forms of energy to renewable clean energy. I am not opposed to renewable clean energy, but I think it needs to be done in a little bit more of a thoughtful, grand strategy way. You can't just flip a light switch off and move into the next sector. If you look at it, we only produce about 7% of our energy resources from renewables right now that are plugged into the grid. Of those, the vast majority require some sort of battery storage solution. Now, I think AI presents a unique opportunity to integrate renewable energies into the electric grid, combined with more traditional forms of fossil fuels and nuclear energy. But I think the approach now has been we need to rush to this new place based on this climate emergency or crisis that's being manufactured, and it's being done so in a way absent any thought to national security, absent any thought to what it does to the economic security, and you're seeing that play out today. Currently, President Trump talks about, on an economic solution, his first words are, we need to fix the energy problem. He's absolutely correct. We've created this ditch that we've trapped ourselves in, and we have to dig out before we can start solving all the other plethora of problems. So I think really the first approach is understanding where we're at with energy and how do you plug in solar? How do you plug in wind with fossil fuels? How do we looked at, look at China's 20 nuclear reactors under construction right now today. The United States is decommissioning 4 this year.
And building 0.
We had 2. Where the
Vogtle plants.
Yep.
Vogtle plants in Georgia, yeah.
Yep. So we've added 2 in 30 years. They're going to add 20 over the next several months. So from a standpoint of looking at how Arthur started this conversation, where great power comes from the 3 characteristics of innovation, free flow of information, and free flow of energy, we've already done a disservice eliminating the free flow of energy. And when it comes to innovation, I don't like to call it AI policy. I like to call it innovation policy, and a vector of innovation policy is AI. We're starting with our hands tied behind our back because we don't have the resources to power the innovation. Now, I will take you back to the NSC and kind of trying to tackle this problem. You look at charging agencies with, let's understand what we have in terms of critical infrastructure and how do we prioritize what we're going to do with it, and how do you bring in an entity like Office of Management and Budget to work with you at solving that problem. In 2019, President Trump signed an executive order strengthening national resilience to electromagnetic pulses. Very nerdy, wonky topic. Not many people probably read it. Very few realize that was the first president to ever sign an executive order on electromagnetic pulses. But hidden in that EO was a directive to the Department of Homeland Security to come up with a list of national critical functions. And what was driving that conversation back in 2018, 2019, as this policy was developed, was the Federal Emergency Management Agency had come out with their 7 community lifelines. They had learned a lot of lessons over the last 2 decades. There's not many shining lights on FEMA. But one of the takeaways from a lot of the mistakes was, what are the 7, they came up with 7 things that they have to do to be able to quickly get into a community, get them up and running, and be able to get the federal government out of the way and let the state and local community resume the recovery. And that was their 7 community lifelines. My hope was to have DHS come back to me and go from 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, too many to throw any meaningful solution at, and come back and say, here are something as simple as your 3 characteristics. What are the 3 things we need to make sure we have to meaningfully address some of our gaps? I think we've spent many hours beating our head against the brick wall, proverbially. But what we're really looking for is, how do we solve for energy issues? How do we solve for communications issues? And how do we make sure the finance sector can continue to move? You have those 3 sectors covered, and the rest of them will fall in line. So here we are. We still don't have that policy out, and we still don't have a way to take federal government spending and bring it in through the NSC and OMB process to prioritize and make sure we're actually addressing something in a grand strategy and doing it in a way that actually moves the needle for the administration and future administrations.
Can I add something important to what you said, of course, is that the hope, as you pointed out, artificial intelligence will improve our ability to integrate difficult and chaotic things. This is a valid point that's made by the AI advocates. The problem, of course, is AI can't make the sun shine, and it can't make the wind blow. So self-evidently, what you're doing is you're trying to manage the assets that we still have to have, the hydrocarbon assets, to fill the holes in, because you don't make energy with AI, you consume energy. And the vector to do that, which has not been thought through, is that you put more communications and controls on the energy consuming and producing systems so that you can delicately manage it. Well, this is called, in your world, increasing the attack surface for cyber attacks. And we saw that the administration is worried about having connected AI cars, your infotainment system using Chinese parts makes them vulnerable to hacking. Well, this is sort of a technical no-duh. All the power conversion hardware that goes on the solar and wind machines are made from power electronics that are dominantly manufactured in China. I don't know, color me cynical. I'm going to say this: the firmware in the simple power control switch and conversion going from DC to AC is got some stealth code in it.
I've got to tell you from firsthand experience, you look at something as simple as bulk power generators, and there's a big effort under President Trump to address the security of bulk power generators. This is something that used to have 14, 16 companies globally manufacturing these bulk power generators. You're down to 3, 2 in China, 1 in Europe. They've undermined the economy, eroded everybody else. And what we did was we took a look at one of the bulk power generators coming from China to a U.S. government-owned energy utility, and we looked at what was in it. And it's amazing, the engineers continued to find things. They're like, there's no reason why this...
What a shock. Who knew?
This component doesn't belong in something as simple as this. So that is a tremendous threat space that we've just begun to scratch the surface.
And do you think something about Hezbollah pagers? And by the way, I asked all the panelists to leave their pagers behind when they came to join us today. Do you think that the Hezbollah pager exploit has sort of heightened awareness and maybe a little anxiety about these questions about components, about you don't know why they happen to be there?
If it didn't, you're asleep.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, the supply chain vulnerabilities that were highlighted by Israel's manipulation of the Hezbollah supply chain, that was done in an environment where they were able to do some intelligence tracking. They had a very easy outcome. China is not targeting military and government installations for its data, its intelligence collection, its cyber features, its cyber effects. They've moved to civilian infrastructure. So in a world where you're dealing with an adversary who does not care what the target surface looks like, you do have to worry about civilian commercial features.
In fact, it epitomizes where Arthur started, at the intersection that seemed to be unrelated worlds. Those who are, happily promoting a more connected grid, babbling about real-time controls of the grid, which has been and still is largely air-gapped, literally physically air-gapped. Most of the critical power controls are done either with data diodes, as you know, or by phone call. Old-fashioned, can you turn that off? Because we don't want them hacked. But that whole universe of energy policy is pushing interconnectivity using Chinese hardware, overtly or implicitly. Then you have the information cyber universe acting like the energy, except in where you come from. This is a mistake of profound proportion. And if AI matters, it matters because it does two things. It not only increases demand for reliable energy, which is why Microsoft is buying a nuclear plant, not a wind farm. If the trope were true that wind and batteries together were the cheapest new source of electricity, Microsoft would not be spending billions of dollars buying an old, decrepit nuke. They'd be building these magic new solar panels with magical batteries. And they're doing that too, but that's not their solution.
Let me ask you both about that question on technological innovation and its impact on both energy. I won't talk about it in terms of AI, because AI is, in a sense, a prime exhibit of how technological innovation can grow and accelerate. Robert Noyce, founder of Intel, used to take the example of comparing computer industry, this is the 1990s, computer industry with the airlines industry. And he said, if there was a Moore's law of being able to increase an output by 150% every 2 years, he said if a Moore's law worked in the airline industry, then you would be able to you would have an airplane that we would carry in your pocket, that you would open up, jump in, fly to a destination, fold up again, and then put back in your pocket. That obviously hasn't happened. When it comes to clean renewables, the issue of technological innovation, it seems to me, is one of the main stumbling blocks. Now, when I was in junior high school, back shortly after the
during the FDR administration, Arthur?
Actually, just after the Civil War. When I was actually it was not 1870, it was 1970. In shop class, we had experiments that we did with solar cells. And it was really interesting, all the kinds of, you could get these interesting results of electric charges from the solar cells from the power of the sun. Basically, solar energy hasn't really grown much faster or better than the cells that we were using in 1970. Wind power, well, let's say that's a power source that's introduced in the 12th century. We think about the transformation that's happened in energy production, in nuclear power, with introduction of fracking. for fossil fuel extraction here. I just want you to speculate for a minute and think about clean renewables. What important technological innovations would be necessary where we could turn to the clean renewables to carry a major share of the burden of the energy grid and of energy output in this country?
I will take the first crack at that and say that we need to have the government stop directing what the R&D should be. We should let the commercial sector, we should let the universities actually explore R&D. The government's not great at innovation. They're great regulators, they're great roadblocks to innovation, but they're not great at genuine innovation. So I think we need to get the government out of the driver's seat on mandating what tomorrow is going to be, which is kind of where we've been for the last 20 years, is heavy mandates on what we want to see in terms of clean renewable energy. I think you leave companies out there, especially in an entrepreneurial way, they will find what the next solution is going to be, absent the need to direct what that solution will be.
In many ways, it's very difficult to foresee what those would be once you turn private enterprise. You know, as I always like to say, that the private sector is built around the goal of making things happen, whereas government is about making sure things don't happen.
Yeah,
and sometimes that's good. Sometimes you want a government that's able to prevent disasters and that has an eye out for risk that may be so severe or catastrophic even that you want to be able to take important steps to prevent that from happening. But it does mean that in the realm of innovation, that government is always going to lag far behind where the private sector and where private entrepreneurs are going. Mark, what about you? What's your take on this?
So Brian and I agree, especially when it comes to foundational innovation, because there's no evidence in history that bureaucrats, policymakers, and politicians are innovators. The best of them are great rhetoricians, Churchillian in their quality and leadership of that kind, but this is finding foundational innovation, to use Bill Gates' line, which is typical of a former coder, has no predictor function, is what he said. So we don't know when or what will appear if you unleash basic research. What governments tend to do is subsidize what already exists, or put differently for innovation, they put more money into yesterday's technologies rather than allow innovators to unleash themselves.
And if I may jump in on that, touching the subject of subsidies, I think when an average American looks at a $35 trillion debt, the last thing they want to see is the government subsidize more things that are not going to move the needle.
Well, except they've believed a fiction that's quasi-implicit in your question, Arthur, which is that we're subsidizing magic new free energy. The sun is free, the wind is free, and we just get to tap it with the silicon. So they invoke tech, and you got, in fact, a Credit Suisse analyst and a few others have now recently said, producing electricity too cheap to meter, resurrecting that hoary old historical anachronism, which is actually not true. He didn't say that, but it's a whole separate piece of history. Nuclear power is going to be too cheap to meter. So here's the problem in the physics of energy. There is no innovation that will make solar energy high energy density to match the energy density of hydrocarbons.
You want to explain a little bit about what energy density is and how that works in terms of comparative analysis of, let's say, fossil fuels versus wind and solar versus nuclear?
And not to go down into the high school physics rabbit hole, but it's important in terms of how people think of an innovation. Electric cars are terrific. Teslas are wonderful vehicles. But the inherent problem you have making cars or airplanes, especially airplanes, is if you're engineering a system, you start with a material that contains energy, that can release energy. So you talk liquid hydrocarbons. In the case of batteries, you have liquid lithiated chemicals with a highly reactive atom. Lithium is very reactive. And so it makes a really good battery. So you start from that and you build machines around it. There's 5,000% more energy per pound in the liquid hydrocarbon, oil, than lithiated
Say that
chemicals.
one more time. How much?
5,000% more. So if you are an airplane designer or you're making a missile and you want to think, I want something to fly fast, far, and carry a load, what do I start with? Well, you don't start with batteries. Now, if you, in the way the physics of energy works, you'd say, well, why aren't my cell phones powered by oil? Well, because the inconvenient fact of how physics of systems work is the combustion engines that can unleash the astounding energy density in liquid hydrocarbons don't scale down. So there's 1/100th the amount of power per cubic centimeter of an internal combustion engine the size of an ant versus the power per pound for an engine in your car. So as you scale it down, you lose 100-fold of the capacity to release the energy in the hydrocarbons because of thermodynamics, another physics problem. So we have policymakers saying silly things. Sun is free. Well, yes, so is oil. The cost of oil is tied up with permissions to get it from where it is, and the machines you can use to get it and convert it. The cost of the sun is tied up in permissions to use land where the sun shines the most and machines you can build to get it. And when you count all those things, you find two things happen. There is no innovation that'll make the sun at a system level cheaper than natural gas or oil or coal. It just won't. There are geopolitical consequences because the machines that we're building, connecting these two worlds, use materials almost entirely refined and produced in China. Battery separators, the electrolytes, the refined minerals, they hold market dominance, double OPEC's dominance. So at the time President Nixon worried about our geopolitical exposure to oil, that was a world in which OPEC, in particular the Middle East, wasn't OPEC. OPEC was formed contemporaneous with our machination. But say the Middle East had incredible market dominance in oil supply to the world. China has double that dominance today in the energy minerals needed to build the green machines. And yet we have policymakers naively believing that geopolitical and economic dominance will never be exercised.
Yep. And that the push for clean renewables, in fact, plays into someone's geopolitical hand, but it's not our hand. Let's talk about AI for a second. We can talk about it in terms of its, in its relationship to the power grid. We can talk about it in terms of the development of smart grid and the role of AI. What about AI and its potential impact, or even impact now, with regard to energy production? In particular, a couple of years ago, I tried to organize a conference on energy production and AI, and the way in which those two technologies could come together when we think about, pushing the fracking revolution to the next level, pushing the nuclear power to the next level in terms of efficiency, in terms of its efficiency, of its cost. And also its safety as well. So you want to say a few things, both of you, about how AI can be this powerful aid to building our energy dominance and even energy supremacy as an energy power?
Well, it's, the economists would call AI a general purpose technology. It has utility in many areas.
Across the board.
So it accelerates and improves discovery, which is important to the future. So next generation catalysts that might make getting hydrogen cheaper and easier are not impossible. We just don't know what they are yet. It's exactly the same as discovery of biological molecules for therapeutics. It's
right.
Complicated. Supercomputers using AI will accelerate. We already know they're accelerating. So the fundamental thing is that what AI does is bring information acceleration into the two areas, not just discovery, but operations, design, and planning. We've already seen the evidence of that. AI has been in widespread use in the industrial sector for years, for 2 decades. I wrote about it in my book before ChatGPT became hot because everybody's using it. The fund I'm a part of invests in AI companies that help oil companies and solar companies figure out how to deploy faster, work faster, use supply chain more efficiently, identify supply sources, de-risk things by doing real-time risk analysis instead of sending, the staff out into the closets to look at things. So it's a genuine accelerant in terms of improving across the board, though. So what's happened is we've found ways to integrate solar more efficiently into a grid dynamically. That's great. You can't make the sun shine. It doesn't make solar cheaper, but it makes it less destructive in integrating into the grid, which is important. It gives it a higher level of penetration than zero. It's not going to replace everything. It doesn't change the physics of energy, but it changes the velocity. It also has changed the velocity of deep water work. So that whole domain of deep water, the third largest, if you had the biggest oil producers in the world, were OPEC, United States, and deep water. That is, broadly speaking, the deep water wells, if it were a country. The timeline from discovery to production has been cut in half, from a decade to 5 years. This all came about because of the information revolution. We didn't discover anything new in terms of the fundamental materials. We discovered, the industry's doing this across the supply chain, use information tools to rapidly accelerate planning and deployment and take a lot of risk and uncertainty out of the game. And this is the holy grail in the military. The military would love to do the same thing, but it turns out that's a lot harder.
Brian, do you have some thoughts on this?
No, I think I completely agree with Mark, and the word I would use to describe AI is an integrator across all the critical infrastructure sectors and across most of the common uses we would see day to day. It's a great integrator and it's a great predictive modeler. I think in my opinion, there's still a need to have a human in the loop, so to speak, and that's, we're not at a place, and I don't think we'll arrive at a place where you want to eliminate the human in the loop. But in terms of integrating complex systems and finding ways to maximize the efficiency, that would be the way I would describe AI.
And that's another reason why the effort to try and regulate and put the brakes on AI development will have implications across the economy, but including in our ability to build a strong energy dominant sector.
I think my biggest fear would be in the United States, we regulate our way out of being a global leader. I think you look at that with...
That's an interesting way to put it. That's a very interesting way to put it.
Well, we've already done that in manufacturing. So the hubris or naivete to think that if you hand money to a manufacturer, that's all they need to come back here. You have to ask first, why did they leave? And it wasn't just because labor was cheaper. It's because the regulatory environment for heavy industry manufacturing is hostile to that manufacturing. The National Association of Manufacturers every 2 years publishes a survey of regulatory compliance costs for small and large-size manufacturers. The latest one's out this spring. If I remember the numbers correctly, for a large industry, the per employee regulatory compliance cost is about $18,000 per employee per year. For small businesses, it's $30,000.
$30,000
per employee per year for compliance, not building stuff. So in China, what do you think the number is? I think it's not zero, it's negative number. But it's certainly closer to zero. And that's why you build factories more quickly there. Yep. Because the economics of it are inherently better in the structures we've chosen. The get out of jail card for us is probably AI. If we still want those regulations, we want to implement them in a more efficient way. We should cut regulations and improve their efficiency.
Let's talk for a minute. We've got about 10 minutes left. Let's talk about, since we're talking about grand strategy, let's talk about the international dimensions of all of this. And in particular, the way in which energy dominance, energy security, energy production will affect our alliance system and our ability both to work more closely with like-minded and trusted allies on the one hand, but also as a form of deterrence for the plans that Russia, China, and Iran have for all of us, not just for the citizens and for their regional dominance here. And again, I have to bring it back to President Nixon, and in particular his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who in the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo told his aides, you know what? The oil-producing countries have their lobbying group. Oil-consuming nations need their lobbying group. And this was the genesis of what became the International Energy Agency, which was the idea, which was to pool the resources and data and knowledge about oil and it's particularly oil consumption then, but energy consumption for the developing nations as a way to understand and plan as ways to be able to resist the kind of leverage that oil-producing countries through OPEC were able to exercise over the global economy. And it's an interesting sidelight that in the course of the discussion with allies, including NATO allies, that the one country that held out against the idea of creating the IEA and fought vociferously against it was France. President Giscard d'Estaing was totally opposed to the idea of such an organization. It's ridiculous to put it all together. And so Kissinger suggested, well, what would France's position be if the IEA were headquartered in Paris? And Giscard d'Estaing all of a sudden realized that the idea of creating an international Energy Agency was a great idea, a wonderful idea.
You don't think that was
which
a
is why it's
negotiating tactic?
why it's still headquartered in Paris today, as a matter of fact. But let's think about where the international implications of this discussion we've just had, how that will spill over, and what we need to be aware of as we strategize America's energy and AI strategy. Brian?
I think when you step back and look at it, our adversaries have already acknowledged this is the future. And so what you're seeing is a coalescing between North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China in the energy sector. And to some extent, I mean, nobody's touching China out of those four. No one of that four is going to touch China in terms of where they're at with the IT space. Now, the vast majority of that was obtained through IP theft, so I don't think that they have the innovation leg of that, the three pillars figured out yet. That being said, all of them acknowledge U.S. regulations as the obstacle for us to have success. And when you're talking to other private sector companies, whether they're owned by U.S. or now international companies, now that I'm out of government, most of these folks that I'm talking to are telling me, well, other countries are finding ways to make it so I have more access to IT needs. They're going to give me more fiber, more data. They're going to give me more access to energy. We talked about China's rapid expansion of nuclear, but that's not just happening in China. You're looking across the GCC. They're rapidly expanding and growing their energy capabilities and capacity. So I think everyone has acknowledged what the future needs to have this global dominance, this global success to achieve power. And for me, again, I just go back to this fear that until we figure out how to relax some of the regulation and the burdens we've put on ourselves, you look at the EPA was stood up in was that the 1970s, and we had a serious problem with clean air, clean water. You look at a photo of LA, and it was disgusting. I'm not saying we're perfect, but we are far below the standards we set for ourselves in the 1970s, yet we continue to try and regulate ourselves to zero. And I don't know if that's healthy in a geopolitical competition sense to regulate yourself to a place that nobody else in the world can get to at your own detriment. So for me, I think it's just, again, we're going back to this regulation, and we continue to push and push and push to what ends other than to just knock ourselves off the pedestal of global power.
So that's a salient point, that the regulatory regime which we impose on our domestic energy and economic output, right, has international implications, and they're not good. Mark?
Well, we're already seeing that. In fact, let's for those who follow the weeds on this, the European Union asked for and announced their study on their economic competitiveness and their industrial challenges. As everyone here doubtless knows, Europe is furiously deindustrializing itself. But the question that this analysis was asked was, why did that happen and what can we do about it? The word energy appears in the final report something like 400 times. So what the European Union, this is the European Union, mind you, so we're talking now about EU bureaucrats, not about Americans, who are pointing out that the deindustrialization of Europe is the principal vector, or the regulators, policymakers, who have made energy expensive and unreliable. So the industries themselves are shrinking, not expanding, not just staying status quo, but shrinking. And they raise that as both an economic problem and it's specifically a geopolitical problem. The fiction that you can regulate a emission standard and then hand money to somebody to leave China and manufacture a product that's made with coal-fired electricity, but do it in Europe with wind and solar, is a fiction. That's not what's happening, whether you do it by fiat or inducement. So the evidence, I don't know what's going to happen with the study because they're confessing they made a mistake, but it's a different universe. They're not the energy planners that made this. The other thing I would say, just from the obvious linkage between geopolitics of energy and our hope for innovation could be epitomized by just give you three numbers to think about, because we in Washington think in money terms, not BTU terms, because money is the lubricant of everything. $1 billion of cars requires about $200 million of energy purchases over a decade. $1 billion of chip factories requires about $300 million of energy purchases over a decade. And it needs to be cheap. $1 billion of data centers requires $700 million of electricity purchases over a decade. We want all three. We're trying to repatriate the factory part On the strategic side, and this is for strategic, not just economic reasons, while the energy policies are antithetical to expanding low-cost energy production. The two worlds didn't get that connected, and they are being connected in China because their energy policies are deliberately to have high value, high reliability in terms of high value, low-cost energy, while they export to the world 80% of the things that we're buying to make our energy more expensive.
One of the things I take tremendous pride in, and you'll probably laugh me out of here for saying this, is during my time on the National Security Council in the last administration, my team brought in the first ever EPA regulator into the National Security Council as a director, policy director. And I remember when we submitted the package to the National Security Council Resource Management Director, she said, "Is this a typo? Is this supposed to be CIA?" I said, "No, it's actually EPA, and one of the, we've been charged with getting rid of regulations, and we need to do it in a way that's meaningful and has insight. So we wanted to bring in somebody who understood the regulations from their side. But at the same time, we brought that person who had never been into some of these national security conversations into the tent to see what's happening on the national security side. And that gentleman left terrified. He's like, that is where I first heard we are going to regulate ourselves right out of being a global leader. So that came from a regulator themselves.
Yeah, that's even more amazing and powerful. On a personal note, towards the end of his life, I got to know T. Boone Pickens, who was, of course, one of the great pioneers in the modern energy industry in America, but also someone who was an enormous champion of natural gas as being the most important of all of the fossil fuel energy sources that the fracking revolution had made possible. And T. Boone used to say to me, he said two things. He said, number one, that we've just begun to see what natural gas can do and how transformative that can be as a clean fossil fuel, as a clean source of energy and power. He also said, we've only just begun to see the impact of the fracking revolution and where that's going to take this country and where that's headed. As you look out with those eyes, the far horizon of American energy future and of American energy grand strategy of how we bring together all of these elements as a way in which to strengthen not only us as a great power and our economy, but also strengthen the forces of freedom, which is really what we're talking about here. Where do you see the most important breakthroughs coming, and where, both as a society, but also in terms of where government can play a constructive role in bringing that future about? I'm going to start with Brian, and Mark, I'll let you finish.
I think it comes in terms of the innovation in the nuclear side. We are on the precipice of seeing small modular reactors really take hold and really be able to start doing what they're ever imagined to do a decade plus ago. I think you're going to see as we move towards these data centers, and DoD is going to need a lot of these data centers to do the things they want to do. And they're not going to be able to put them overseas. They're not going to be able to put them away from a power supply. So I think there's going to be a real drive to get SMR technology up and running. And I think once we develop that and refine that, and some of the things I'm hearing from individuals working on that technology and the ability to use recycled or once disposed of nuclear waste to create these SMRs, I think we unlock a lot of potential that just wasn't there a decade ago.
So I agree with you, Brian. I'm a nuclear bull. Before I joined the Reagan administration, I was at the accident at 3 Mile Island, defended the virtues of nuclear energy. There are 60 new designs for nuclear power plants around the world today. The IAEA tracks these things. Technically, all of them will work. Which ones will work economically? This is what we need. The United States led the commercial nuclear revolution. It should do it again. But here's if a president wants to make a generational change, it would be to do two things. And it's not independence. We want to restore our leadership, call it dominance if you like, in commercial nuclear energy. We have the capacity, we have the knowledge, but that's a decadal goal. That's like it's like a Kennedy-class goal, because we're not going to be building many of those new nukes until we build the first ones, test them, and try them. In the short term, the generational opportunity is really easy to identify geopolitically. On the margin, the marginal new energy sources. The dominant source of marginal new energy in the world is natural gas, overwhelmingly, not wind and not solar. The magnitude of natural gas demands that are emerging for the world are astronomical. The U.S. is the single most efficient, largest producer of natural gas on the planet. In my view, it could double its capacity of exports and do it rapidly, not in a decade, but in years. What it would require is a president to base, and this would, by the way, result in an astonishing flood of foreign direct investment into the United States, because if you're a consumer of energy, you want to at least have some significant share of your supply coming from here, not from Qatar and not from the Middle East and Iran. So the single most effective geopolitical thing a president could do in the short term, long term, nukes, full bore. Short term, it's unleash natural gas exports, which, because we have the capacity, T. Boone Pickens was correct. However, we don't have, we are nibbling around the edges with feckless legislation relating to this right now. No one is being bold. And the boldness that needs to come from a president doing something like President Nixon did, set a very specific goal. The United States could set the goal that we will be the go-to supplier for natural gas for the world for the next decade. You want it, you come to us first. It'll be cheapest, the most reliable, and we'll get it to you fastest. We actually have the technical capacity to do that in the next few years, not in a decade.
Audience, thank you so much for joining us for the last panel for our discussion. And let's give a special thanks to our panelists for what has been, I think, and I hope has been a really eye-opening discussion.